Hi everyone, welcome back. So this week we're talking about species interactions. We've all learned for years and years, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, just in general life, seeing species interact. And some of this might be review, some of it might be new, but again, even if it's review, think about it in the context of disturbance and disturbed environments. So species interactions will go through a bit quick introduction and the conceptual basis of competition, and then we'll think about the link between competition and coexistence. We'll finish up talking about the denial of coexistence, which we call competitive exclusion, and then cooperation and coexistence, which is mutualism. For this video, I'll again, similar to last week, I'll split this week into two videos so that you can watch one and go about your life, and then watch two when it fits. Each one, hopefully, 10-ish minutes or whatever. But I'll cover these three parts: introduction, conceptual basis of competition, and the link between competition and coexistence in this first video, and then we'll finish up with the second. So species interactions. Why should we even be concerned with species interactions in disturbed ecosystems? Well, in general, if we think about all those species traits, those life history traits of species that move in initially following a disturbance, we know that that initial community is governed mostly by colonization. So which species can even get there? But as time goes on, those vegetation communities switch between something assemblages that are dominated by colonization to those that are dominated by competition for existing resources. Additionally, succession changes are not really just the response of the species and their response to the physical changes in the environment. We know nutrients and light and temperature, all these physical changes to the environment are important for species, but it's not just that. They also interact with each other, and so those biological, biotic interactions are important to consider also. And if you remember, we talked about some successional theories, successional mechanisms, community assembly rules. We talked about community assembly, how a community is determined by through a series of filters, what species are there in the region, what kind of environmental conditions exist, letting those species sort of filter through and end up being at that place and that time in the first place. So when we think about community assembly, competition and species interactions are really important, one of those important filters for community assembly. In general, we can think about species interactions based on whether they're positive or negative towards each other. So species can be neutral, really they are there, but they're not really interacting much, or they're interacting, but it's not positive or negative, it just is. We could think about it in terms of commensalism, where one species benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. We could think about it in terms of competition, interspecific competition between two species. And this is really where both species are negatively affected. Predation, one species benefits and the other is harmed. Parasitism, really the same as predation, but it's talking about parasites living on or within their hosts. There's also something called amensalism. It's not commonly talked about or referred to, but it's where one species is not affected, but the other is harmed. And then there's mutualism, where both species benefit. And we'll talk a little bit about mutualism in the next video. Okay, so true or false to start out this, again, still thinking about an introduction of species interactions. True or false? The traits of neighboring individuals either mesh well, resulting in coexistence, or compete strongly, resulting in replacement. Well, it's false, and oftentimes it's important to recognize that it's false because a lot of times we think about the natural environment in terms of how this true or false question is kind of set up, where things either mesh really well and they can work together, or they're bitter enemies and they just will never work. But oftentimes what we actually find is that there can be competition leading still to coexistence. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But in general, competition is really fascinating for ecologists. I'm fascinated by competition. Most people I talk to who study ecology and study plants and animals are interested in competition because it's this really tangible, kind of real life phenomenon that we can observe and that we can analyze. And we can think about it ourselves. We compete with other people. Certainly right now, you go to the grocery store and everybody's trying to get that last parcel of whatever might be left over. People are competing all the time, and similarly in the natural world and in disturbed environments, plants are competing also. But when we actually go out into the field and try and study competition under natural settings, it really does remain quite an elusive phenomenon. It makes sense intuitively, but it's really difficult to collect data on competition. But the concept of competition is really intuitively understood. So we went through a few definitions of like what disturbance really means early on in the semester, but there's really no debate about competition. So these formal definitions, there's really not a lot of them. But there are three primary concepts within the various definitions. So number one, different species share the same resource. They have to be competing for something. And that thing that they're competing for has to be in short supply. So if there's plenty of it to go around, they're really not competing for anything. And number three, the species involved are affected adversely, negatively, by each other during the process of actually getting that resource. So if two things are going to compete, there has to be some shared thing that they're both interested in acquiring. That thing, that resource, has to be in short supply, and they're both negatively harmed by that competition. Now, the degree to which species are affected by competition, those competitive interactions, varies significantly. Competition can be quite one-sided and may tend more towards that amensalism, where one species is like, meh, does not impact me, and the other's harmed significantly. Or it might be where each species is really negatively impacted and it is a struggle for survival. But whatever it is, competition does imply negative effects on at least one party, one individual, one species within that competition. It makes it imply, it makes us think that competition and coexistence might be mutually exclusive, might be opposing tendencies, where one or more species will eventually be eliminated when competition exists. But if competition is always happening, there's limited water or limited nitrogen or limited space or limited sunlight, how then is competitive exclusion avoided for these communities that seem quite stable? Well, often it's because competition is quite variable. It's variable with widely variable outcomes and effects. And in some cases, those outcomes can be really significant, resulting in complete species replacement. But in others, because of that variability, that competition can be kind of negligible and coexistence can occur. Maybe everything is competing for different things, but maybe, again, because plants and individuals can partition where they send those resources, maybe they're able to go acquire that resource and maximize its acquisition instead of another. So because competition can be variable, it might lead to coexistence. Which leads us to this, when we're thinking about the conceptual basis of competition here, we really need to think about scale, matters of scale. So one type of scale we can think of is time, the temporal scale on which we're talking about. When we think about competition, often we think pretty short time frames, right? Like as an ecologist, as a student, we're thinking on the matter on a core time scale of years, right? I write some research proposal and I'm going to collect data for, on average, 2 or 3 years. But 2 or 3 years is really nothing when we're thinking about big trees or certain organisms. So the timescale involved in these competitive interactions may just be too great for us to really grasp the correct picture of competition. We might see a stable community, but there might be intense competitive dynamics happening. It's just over timescales we can't appreciate. And we also need to think about the magnitude of the competition compared to how variable nature tends to be. So only those competitive dynamics that are strong enough to overcome kind of the background noise of how variable communities are going to stand out. And this really does leave a gap in our understanding of the potential impacts and the importance of fairly weak competition over long time frames. So to give you an example of this, let's look at this picture of a forest. So we're kind of looking down at this forest and we kind of see a bunch of different trees. Maybe there's, I don't know, a whole bunch of different species. It looks like different shapes and sizes and different colors. So let's imagine from left to right, we have a period of 1,000 or a 10-year period, sorry. So let's picture a 3% reduction in the abundance of one particular species over a 10-year period. So let's think about this species, this one individual. We've replaced this one individual over 10 years from left to right. Again, left is like at year 0, and the right image is 10 years later. That one individual has changed. Is that significant? Well, it's hard to say. If that is a trend that happens for 1,000 years, then that's pretty significant. If it's just the random stochastic change of individuals within a community, it's not significant. But a 3% reduction might be significant over 1,000 years. If I study it over 2 to 3 years, it's a negligible amount because ecosystems are too noisy for me to appreciate this. But if that rate of reduction continues, that population might be completely exterminated from this community over 1,000 years. Now, conversely, a set of species may show intense competition for a few years, but because the effects are really just a short duration, there might not actually be a long-term implication for the community. So I might, in my 2 to 3 year study, might detect significant competition and extrapolate from that significant changes over 1,000 years, but over that 1,000-year period, maybe it's actually not that important. So competition and coexistence. Where current competition occurs, coexistence may be achieved in really two broadly different ways. And this depends entirely on the strength of that current competition. You might have competitive coexistence or non-competitive coexistence. So competitive coexistence is made possible despite the presence of strong competition. And this might be because of some extrinsic factors mitigating that competition, because again, competition and the environment are so variable, they might allow for that coexistence even under intense competition. But we also have non-competitive coexistence where the species are competing, but that competition is relatively weak. So because it's weak, it might be a long time where that competition is going to potentially impact the community, but it might just be so long that it really, we could just define it as coexistence in the first place. And this table kind of walks us through modes of species coexistence under competition. So it splits it between current competition and competition in the past. If you're interested in evolution, thinking about past competition might be particularly important, and thinking about current competition might be important for thinking of how these individuals might change going forward. So if there's current competition, yes versus no, maybe that competition is intense, and that's what we would call competitive coexistence. Or maybe that competition is weak. So competition is weak, leading to non-competitive coexistence. And oftentimes this leads to niche separation or partial niche separation, which we'll go through on the next slide. If we're thinking in the past, if there was past competition, again, if that competition was intense, we might have that niche separation, that co-evolutionary niche separation, where both species are trying to reduce that competition by changing their niche slightly. And again, we'll go over this on the next slide. But you might have non-competitive coexistence if the competition is weak. So what is niche separation really talking about? If there's intense competition, individuals that have less competition are going to survive and reproduce better than individuals that are highly competitive with other species. So let's think about classic example of Darwin's finches. We're stepping outside of the disturbance area here, but just to think about this concept. So we're thinking about Darwin's finches, and Darwin's finches, we're thinking about the Galapagos Islands. And in this graph, in this figure, we're looking at vertically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different islands. Each island has Darwin's finches on it, but different groups of species. And so we see 3 different species here: small, medium, and large. And the size of their beak is often talked about as being important based on what food it can actually access. So if it has a big beak, it can access these big seeds, big fruits. If it's got a small beak, maybe it's more insectivorous, or maybe it can only eat those small beads, those small seeds. The island at the top shows what happens to beak size. So again, we're thinking about beak size, and on the x-axis is the actual size of the beaks and sort of the population distribution of that beak size. And when all 3 birds co-occur in one island, those beak sizes are pretty different from each other, right? The big is way over here, the middle is there, and then the small is way over there. But what happens, maybe let's talk about all the way down at the bottom, when that tiny bird exists on an island without the competition from those bigger species? Well, it turns out that the beak size is actually quite larger because it's not competing with the bigger birds. It might actually be the presence of the bigger birds that shoves that beak size further down when they coexist. Similarly, let's think about the island second from the bottom. That's the middle bird. It's almost exactly the same as that first island from the smaller bird. They've kind of converged to be sort of this middle ground of beak size. So without that competition, again, they kind of spread out and it's not as constrained. All right, so that's the end of this first video. Again, we're thinking about competition and coexistence. So one method of coexistence is niche separation to kind of reduce that competition, because when competition is weak, there can be competitive coexistence. So I'm going to stop the video here, and the second video you'll see will finish up talking about the denial of coexistence, which is competitive exclusion, and the cooperation and coexistence, which we think of as mutualism.